Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. I can't believe tomorrow will be episode 50. I want to do something special, but it came up so fast that for episode 100, I'll make it an extraordinary one, and I already think I know who I want to have as a guest for that one. But check back tomorrow to see what I came up with for episode 50. But nonetheless, thank you all so much for the support. Check out my website at fortynine.com, which I'm going to be updating a ton soon because right now it's just a link to all my episodes. Also, donate to me on Patreon if you can. It's patreon.com/the Peace and Liberty Podcast. I already have a few patrons, but so far a dime hasn't been spent, and any money used will be to do live events and stuff like that. So if you can't tell by now, everything I do is for a purpose. Most of my early podcast episodes have been introductions to libertarianism, and I wanted to have those on the record for anyone that's struggling to bring others on board. But there's a world of history and economics I want to talk about. So without further ado, I want to talk today about... Let me start the whole thing over, actually. And then I'll feel comfortable with that. All right. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. I can't believe tomorrow will be episode 50. I want to do something special, but it came up so fast that for episode 100, I'll make it an extraordinary one. And I already think I know who I want to have as a guest for that one. But check back tomorrow, you can see what I did for episode 50. But nonetheless, thank you all so much for the support. Check out my website, fortynine.com, which I'm going to be updating a ton soon because right now it's just a link to all my episodes. It doesn't look that great. Also, donate to me on Patreon if you can. It's patreon.com/the Peace and Liberty Podcast. I have a few patrons so far, and not a dime has been spent, and any money used will be used to do things like live events, etc. So if you can't tell by now, everything I do is for a purpose. Most of my early podcast episodes have been introductions to libertarianism, and I wanted to have those on the record for anyone that's struggling to bring others on board. But there's a whole world of history and economics I want to talk about. So without further ado, I want to talk about Venezuela today. And I'm going to divide this into two parts. The first is I'll give you some background regarding Venezuela in general and how they got to where they are now. And in the second part, I'll touch on some recent news, which is that supposedly Kellogg's wants to withdraw their factories. And Maduro is saying, no, you can't do it. And at a recent rally, he claimed the production is now in the hands of the workers, which, what does that even mean? I mean, it's like, imagine you're working in a country and a group of armed men come and say, hey, you will all own the factory now. Keep the cornflakes coming. Now, in an environment like that, orders are top down, not bottom up. And it doesn't matter if you think they should be bottom up. These workers, who are most likely happy to be alive and to get to the next day, aren't in a position to run a factory. We'll talk about that. So I'm going to link to many articles this episode, but the first is from a Mises.org article, and it's a piece by Jose Nino titled Venezuela Before Chavez, Prelude to Socialist Failure. So to understand Venezuela, like any country, we have to go farther back in time. The article notes, quote, before the completion of its first oil rig on April 15th, 1914, Venezuela was essentially a banana republic marked by political instability. Despite gaining independence from Spain, Venezuela maintained many of its primitive political and economic practices, above all, its exclusionary mercantilist and regulatory policies that kept it in an impoverished state. So during the 1910s up to the 1930s, Juan Vicente Gomez, who ruled at that time, created conditions for the vast amount of oil deposits to be discovered, and fairly freely. He maintained decent enough relations with other countries to trade with them. Now, in the 1950s, General Marcos Perez Jimenez would continue Gomez's legacy. Now, at this point, you got to understand, Venezuela was at its peak, ranking 4th in terms of per capita GDP worldwide. So it's hard not to profit off the oil reserves when they're there, but especially when people are free in such a climate. That's the key, to be free. And in a little bit, I'll give you some statistics about Venezuela that will blow your mind. But the article goes on to say, quote, a combination of a relatively free economy, an immigration system that attracted and assimilated laborers from Italy, Portugal, and Spain, and a system of strong property rights allowed Venezuela to experience unprecedented levels of economic development from the 1940s up until the 1970s. In 1958, however, Jimenez's government was overthrown by leftists in a coup, and the aftermath was a naval officer by the name of Wolfgang Larrazabal, who took office till elections were held later that year. Now, the guy they really should have been worried about was Remulio Betancourt, and he ruled from 1959 to 1964. Now, Betancourt, he was an ex-communist. Supposedly, he renounced his prior Marxist ways, but he still considered himself a social democrat. And his true aim was to fully nationalize everything. Everything. Him and other student activists wanted to fully nationalize petroleum at the time in Venezuela, and to, quote, use petroleum rents to establish a welfare state of sorts. And the same idea led to the nationalization of oil later on. Now, quoting again, under this premise, a nationalized oil industry would finance cheap gasoline, let me start that over. And the same idea led to the nationalization of oil. Quoting again, under this premise, a nationalized oil industry would finance cheap gasoline, free education at all levels, healthcare, and a wide array of other public services. And it's important to remember, Betancourt was the moderate in terms of politics in Venezuela at that time. He wasn't nearly as radical as Chavez and Maduro, but he still helped devalue the bolivar. He failed land reform that undermined property rights, and the constitution laid out was still based off positive rights mostly rather than negative rights. Tax rates tripled to 36% under him, and of course, spending increased. Now, Carlos Perez, who was another leader after Betancourt, capitalized on the oil boom of the 70s. And by the way, there was a 1970s energy crisis you can read about in which they heavily benefited from the exporting of petroleum at that time. And finally, in 1975, Perez had nationalized petroleum, fulfilling Betancourt's dream. So again, I'll link to that one article on Mises.org. It's a super informative article. But let's fast forward now. And before I move on to some other statistics, let me point out a few things about Venezuela to help you get an idea of what the landscape of this country is like. I also just wrote a piece of Liberty Hangout, which I'll link to. And instead of linking you to all the billion links, just read that article, which has all the links in there you'll need, especially for this next part. So Venezuela is a country of 33 million people currently, and they have the largest known oil reserves in the world. They have 300,878 proven oil reserves, and that number has probably increased since it's last been tallied. Now, to compare to the country with the second most oil reserves, that's Saudi Arabia, and they have 266,455 known reserves. So just to give you a gauge on that real quick, Venezuela has over 7.6 times as much oil reserves, as many oil reserves as the US. They have an unbelievable amount of oil, an unbelievable amount. But here's another way to think about all this. Venezuela, who again has the most known oil reserves, has a total land area of 353,841 miles squared. This is a little bit larger than the size of Texas. But keep in mind, this area, slightly larger than the size of Texas, has 7.6 times more oil than the entire US. Again, Venezuela is a country that's 353,841 miles squared, while the US is a whopping 3.797 million miles squared. Can you try to imagine? Now, how does Venezuela compare to Saudi Arabia? Well, Saudi Arabia's total land mass is second. Excuse me. Now, how does Venezuela compare to Saudi Arabia? Well, Saudi Arabia's total land mass is 2.25 times the size of Venezuela's at 830,000 miles squared. So hopefully this all gives you some So hopefully that gives you all a relative understanding of how wealthy this country really is, and the fact that people are starving. And the way they're starving, it's senseless. Now, here's some other statistics to ponder on. Between 2004 and 2015, Venezuela made $750 billion in oil, and this accounted for 96% of its foreign earnings. During this boom period, Chavez forced bonds to be issued. He borrowed heavily. And this left them with a huge budget deficit. Does any of this sound familiar? It's sort of like what the US government does, right? So their budget deficit by 2012 reached 15.6% of their GDP. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of GDP as a statistic, but when your numbers are showing 15.6% of your GDP, of your gross domestic product, is eaten up by your budget deficit, Well, even worse, between 1999 and 2014, they spent $718 billion on social welfare programs. And there was only one problem. Oil production itself dropped from 3.2 million barrels a day to 1.5 million, which caused imports to drop from 66 billion in 2012 to 9.2 billion in 2018. Now, Chavez came into power in 1999, and he instituted what he called 21st century socialism. And of course, since 1999, Venezuela's had universal health care, which, funny enough, they've had to import Cuban doctors. But the thing I'm about to say next, or the things about to say next, are horrifying. But people there are starving. Just try to understand. This isn't a cliche phrase we're using to denounce socialism. People are starving. Many may remember the incident in 2015 when a Venezuelan governor was telling hungry people to eat fried rocks. A report from May 2016 talks about a guy named Roberto Sanchez, he's an unemployed construction worker there. And hopefully he's still alive given this happened 2 years ago and the turmoil the country's faced. But he said, quote, "We have no food. They are cutting power 4 hours a day. Crime is soaring. And President Nicolas Maduro blames everyone but himself for the mess we find ourselves in. We can't go on like this forever. Something has to give." Ramon Muchacho, mayor of the Caracas district of Chicao, said in a tweet, "People are hunting dogs and cats in the streets and pigeons in the plazas to eat. Just anything they can get their hands on." Another lovely report, this one's from August 2017, said, quote, "Zoo animals are being stolen from parks in western Venezuela, and police believe they're being snatched to be eaten by the starving local population. A wave of animal thefts in the city of Maracaibo, near the Colombian border, including tapirs and a buffalo, have been linked to the chronic food shortages in Venezuela. Most recently, two collared peccaries, similar in appearance to boars, were stolen over the weekend, local police say." Talk about devastating. So how could this possibly get any worse? Well, some 2018 statistics for you now. Hyperinflation is so extreme that prices double in Venezuela every 17.5 days. The annual inflation rate is 16,428%. That's their annual inflation rate. It hasn't been this bad there since the 80s and 90s. Now, this is kind of the second part of the episode, which talks about Kellogg's. Kellogg's in Venezuela, and forgive me, I'm not sure if they have multiple factories there or not, but BBC News reported that, quote, "Workers said they were prevented from entering the plant in the central city of Maracay on Tuesday, which President Maduro declared absolutely unconstitutional and illegal." So Maduro apparently wasn't happy with this decision, saying, "We've begun judicial proceedings against the business leaders of Kellogg's because their exit is unconstitutional." You can watch the clips online for yourself. Just hit that translate button and you can get an English version. But he notably said this: "The town has a president and a government that will continue to produce now in the hands of the working class." And what he's saying is that he's going to give the factories over to the workers. And we briefly discussed this earlier, but what does this even mean? There's this one experiment done where a guy tried to gather 8 essential food items, or maybe just, I don't know if it was food items, just regular items, just 8 items. He spent the whole morning, ended up with 3. Now, do you really think these people have much leisure time to absorb more knowledge and increase their skills? Give me a break. Would you believe for a second that even in a first world country like America, that if we just simply gave, say, a Dunkin' Donuts to the workers, that they would somehow figure it out? That they would figure out how to handle inventory, run marketing, etc. Again, give me a break. These people live in destitute poverty, which most people couldn't even imagine. Now, funny enough, well, not funny, but ironically enough, in 2016, the same thing happened. Kimberly Clark, who makes Huggies diapers and Kleenex tissues, were taken over. Quote, "Venezuelan authorities took over a plant belonging to the American personnel care products manufacturer and renamed it Cacique Maracay Productive Plant after a local Indian leader who fought against Spanish colonial rule in the 16th century. Now, the results were telling. Production was rapidly reinitiated at the plant following the expropriation, with the national government stepping in to provide financing worth US $22 million. When operating at full capacity, this is the scary part, the plant can reportedly meet 20% of national demand for diapers, sanitary pads, toilet paper, and other scarce personal care products. Folks, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, but this is no laughing matter at all. This is a country that is in absolute turmoil. I'm not sure what the answer is, but knowing this all, I hope you feel the duty to spread the message of peace and liberty and denounce socialism. We were born to do more than to eat fried rocks. Let me tell you that. Thanks, everybody. Check out fortpeaceandliberty.com. Listen to past episodes. Support me on Patreon. See y'all tomorrow for episode 50.